You're listening to the Mind Your Own Business podcast, aimed at helping photographers learn how to make the leap from amateur to pro. Hello, and welcome to Mind Your Own Business, a joint effort brought to you by Photofocus and Skip Cohen University. This is Shamira Young, and I'm joined by my co-host and king of creative content, Skip Cohen. Skip,
oh my God.
What's up?
By the way, I think sometime over the last 99 podcasts we've done together, you used king of creative content.
See, and I was wondering...
You're duplicating them, but you know.
I was like, did I say king of content, king of creative content?
How about king of a quest for creative content? Because that's what this is all about. And man, we've got a great podcast today.
Yes, we do. Let's get to it.
We've got Deb Sandidge joining us today, and it's just going to be a fun one. And it's mostly because she's one of the most creative artists in imaging. And since we're unscripted, who knows where creativity is going to take us. Now, if you don't know Deb, she's a Nikon ambassador with a focus on travel and art, but I don't think there's anything she can't photograph or probably hasn't. She's also an artist, an instructor, a speaker, and a great friend to a lot of us in the industry. And I haven't known Deb very long, but we've had a number of phone conversations. We share a whole bunch of mutual friends. And she's one of those people who comes into your life and then you don't remember when she wasn't there. Mm-hmm. So best of all, out of all of this, she never stops pushing the edge of the creative envelope. In fact, one of her signatures is long exposures. And if you missed it, check out the image we recently shared on the Skip Cohen University blog. In the Y series, because it was a 4-minute exposure and it's absolutely stunning. So on that note, Deb, this is the cue for your lips to move. Welcome to Mind Your Own Business.
Well, thank you very much for having me on Mind Your Own Business. I'm excited to be here and talk about everything creative in the photography industry.
And we are excited to have you here, Deb. And just to kick it off, can you explain to us, kind of describe how you got started? What's your background, origin story, as far as what you're doing today?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one of the things that really led me to, or sort of evolved into what I was doing, is I was very interested in infrared photography because it's not so literal. You see a lot of pictures in color, but infrared was really, really different. So that came somewhat of a passion, sort of an obsession, and I wanted to learn everything about it. So I became just very well versed on how to work with long exposure. So what happened was that a company noticed, it was Wiley, who's a publisher of books, and they asked me to write a book about infrared. So that was a huge step for me, So it was working the craft, learning the craft, working with my creative outlets there, and then writing it down, which is, another voice altogether, other than just, speaking or talking about it, but writing it so people could get it and understand. So that was a lot of fun. So that book, I would say, was a calling card to really working towards the future, getting my work noticed. And so it's still something I'm really passionate about, but I have a few other things I love to do now.
I'm just curious, what was your first paid client in photography? Or what type of job was it? Not really who was the first?
Mm-hmm. So as far as a position or as far as...
Anything. I mean, where you had a love for photography, mm-hmm. What turned it into being a business?
Oh, I was asked to be part of an interview. So it was about a photo I had taken. It was something I was, again, very passionate about at the time. So I was actually a bird photography. And you probably have never seen any of my bird photos, but it was something that I was super interested in. But they liked the shot. There was something about the shot. It was the grace, the gentleness, the expression of the bird's wings as she extended her wings. And there was really a story in that shot. So that's what they wanted to do. So they wrote a story about it, and then that sort of stepped into something else. And then it was asked to do other projects. So it was just something that built on itself. So again, I was contacted to work with lifestyle projects, and which was really an interesting thing. So I think the big thing is just getting noticed and getting work out there. And again, that will go to something we'll probably talk about in a little bit, social media.
Well, one of your signatures that I mentioned at the beginning is creativity. And the great portrait photographer, which sadly too many of our listeners would have never had a chance to meet, is Don Blair. And Don used to say, you have to know the rules before you're allowed to break them. And he broke them all the time, whether it was the rule of thirds or composition, whatever it was. Don was always trying to push the envelope. And this is all pre-digital. And I'm just curious because you clearly know the rules, but your signature has become breaking them. And people will look at an image. It's like the image of the lifeguard house that we just featured on Y. Mm-hmm. And that lifeguard stand is a 4-minute exposure, and it's lit by the lights of the city behind you, and it's just so beautiful. Where did that quest to just go out and mix up the recipe come from?
Oh, I like thinking about that. That's because it's such a pleasure to me to be able to shoot and have something come from the heart, and that's what I feel that happened. I think there's a point in the beginning where you're practicing and you're learning the craft and you're mastering a technique, and then you're expanding on ideas, and then really you're dedicating yourself to learning all that you can learn about something. And when you find that you are finding your place in this, have a lot of passion. And then there's that step beyond. There's imagination and creativity where, I'm shooting basically the same subject. I've been too many times, but the situation changed. Maybe it's different clouds. And I think, I hate to think of rules. I think of them as guidelines, and they're sort of subconscious to what I'm doing. The bigger picture is, how can I make this uniquely my shot? What is it that I can do to create something that's really from the heart, that's very different, and that hasn't been said before as that same story. So things just sort of come to me. So I guess that's really where imagination and creativity come in. So if I'm in front of a beautiful bridge, a cityscape or a landscape, or just thinking about what is it that I can do to take it to the next level. So it's not so much the rules. I'm thinking, okay, what do I have with me? Maybe there's a neutral density filter, or maybe I can just use the darkness of night or something different. So I see things that have been photographed many, many times before. So I like to see them presented in a different way. And I think that's where the creative spirit comes in.
So one of the things that many folks struggle with, including myself, I'll use myself as an example, sometimes it's hard to find the motivation to pursue creative projects, or maybe I should say personal projects, special projects, where a client is not paying us to do it because we get so caught up in the day-to-day businessy stuff of, paying those pesky bills and trying to find more clients. And so as far as you finding the time and the motivation to pursue these special projects, especially when you don't necessarily know, where you'll end up or if anyone will see these images that you make or get noticed. So how do you find the time and the motivation? How do you carve out time during your week to pursue these special projects?
That's a great question. So I think that along the way with regular work that you and I would have to do, I try to find time to build in something, because I think what I do as far as being, again, experimental and experiential works into the creative aspect. And I feel like that expands my work. I mean, one thing leads to another. I may shoot something more literal, maybe it's for a client. Then maybe I'll have some time and I'll work in something that I want to do. It's like, okay, well, this is from the shot list, but what happens with these clouds? What happens if I create a time lapse? What happens if I stack these images? What happens if I create a slow motion video, for example? So there's a lot of things that pop up in my head as I'm shooting. And I may just want to try a new idea. Maybe I want to work with the idea of long exposure. So then I'll try the neutral density filter. So when I have a great subject, I really want to be able to work that subject as much as possible. So I'll try different things to see what happens. This is what happens if is sort of my motto. So what happens if I get that neutral density filter? And what happens if I make a series of exposures? And so there's a lot of different options as I shoot. So I try to build that into my time.
I love that because you're working in your own fun stuff while shooting on assignment. I mean, that's, what do they call that? Time stacking, maybe? And making a very efficient use of your, no, that's really great.
There's stories about Ansel Adams spending, oh God, I've heard 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours in the darkroom, coming out and bringing a printout, looking at it, hating it, ripping it up and going back in. I think one of the things that's so exciting, and I write this all the time, I'm never sure on how many years photography has been around, but if you Google how old is photography, you're going to come up with somewhere between 190 and 195 years old, depending on what you consider the starting point. And today, photographers have more creative tools than at any time in the history of imaging. And I think about, Deb, as you're talking about, and you just want to really explore and spend that time on a particular subject or on a particular technique. And I'm thinking about what it would have been like to have been standing there when Ansel came out with a print and loved it and then had him rip it up and go back into the darkroom. Are there any specific techniques that you just, what are some of your favorites? Obviously, on your website, that homepage where you've dragged the shutter in the middle of traffic somewhere is remarkable. The shot that we shared on SCU with the 4-minute exposure. But what are some of the techniques that you just are enjoying now? You mentioned bird photography earlier. You're talking about clouds. Do you tend to have a bunch going all at once, or is there one favorite that you focus on and stay with?
Exactly. I do a lot of travel photography, but I think what the biggest thing with that type of photography is I like to convey a sense of time passing. So that's where using a shutter speed that's more than several seconds, that might even go into several minutes, then it changes the whole dynamic of the shot. So everybody can shoot a cityscape in basically the same way and stand in the same position. But if I shoot it for several minutes, then over time, things change dramatically, and all that is captured in that several minutes. And to me, that really builds an exciting photograph. It becomes more expressive, it becomes more personal. And as I'm shooting, then I'm thinking about the next way to do it. Maybe there's another idea. Maybe I can make a slow motion video, or I can do this. But I have this sort of a checklist of things in my mind as I'm shooting. But the biggest thing is I love the idea of conveying a sense of time passing. To me, that is a big driver for me.
Well, you mentioned earlier that with your images, you love conveying a story.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that you mentioned that, because so much of photography is storytelling. And I don't care what field of photography anyone focuses on, whether it's wedding photography, family photography, even portrait photography, there's always a story behind that image. And so I love that you highlight that. And, I'm curious, because it's obvious you put in a whole lot of thought into these projects, into these images that you create. And you mentioned earlier the process of, or you didn't go into detail, which is why I want to bring it back, but you mentioned getting noticed, getting your images noticed, and how one of your first opportunities as far as getting a paid project or an image paid for, your bird image got noticed. And so for the photographers out there listening, I'm sure they're curious, and I'm curious, after you've created these amazing images, what steps do you take to get them noticed? I know many of us just kind of throw stuff up on social media, on Facebook, and kind of hope, like throwing stuff at a wall. But do you have a process for getting your work noticed?
Well, the end game isn't so much getting it noticed, but it is very helpful to have it out there. People see the different types of work that you do, mm-hmm. and of course, anytime that you share what you know about how you made this shot, what it was the behind the scenes thing, you really become a mentor. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you inspire others. So I think that, especially with Nikon, I think, and leading to become an ambassador, is having something that, as you said, tells a story, but it also can be inspirational, educational. People can learn from it. So I try to speak about what I do in a way that is helpful to other people. There are techies who want to know that f-stop. What is that shutter speed? So, and it's super helpful, because there may be somebody out there who's just starting, and you're the person that they connect with. It's like, I love that. I love what she does. I love what he does. And I want to work in that direction, but, I just I can't break those technical barriers. But in time, that does happen. And of course, having, this goes back to having your stuff on social media is important. You have people who are looking and are finding your work and asking you about it. It's like, what happened with this picture? I shot a reflection picture. I was very into reflections for a while, and there was a boat photo, and they asked, this is years and years ago, and I got asked to post it and have it hanging in a Consumer Electronics show back a while ago. And it was I was honored, to have that happen. But see, then they got, that got noticed. What was it about that picture that drew a client in? They know that you could master this technique and that people liked it, so there's a lot of things that go into it. But and the simplest thing, when you're doing this on social media, you guys both do this, but your name is so vital. No one's going to know, the colors of Kansas or something. They need to know who you are. So it's important just to say who you are. Everybody knows me. I'm Deb Sandidge on social media. That's how they can find me. So they can find me on Instagram or Twitter. So that makes it very easy for a client to say, hey, I'd like that. Can we ask her about, doing some work here?
You mentioned being a Nikon ambassador, and that triggered that little light bulb over my head here. Let's switch gears just for a second and talk about the importance of relationship building. You've got a remarkable network. In fact, it's really funny, but I knew of you, I knew your work, and had thought about, let's get you involved in something on SCU, and I really loved the time we did when we talked about that Y image. But then in talking with Larry at Platypod, Larry goes back a few years in terms of working with you and photography. And suddenly, so often we find that this industry is a very small industry, and new people coming in don't realize all the connections we have. What suggestions or what things have you seen in your career that just pointed out how important that relationship building is?
That's a really good point. I think it's important to make yourself available. If somebody asks you to do something, if you can do it, make yourself available, talk more about how you can help each other. I learn by teaching, when I'm speaking or teaching, it's just, I learn so much from everybody else. So then again, you build these relationships along the way with fantastic people. And I'm so grateful that I've met so many wonderful people who've touched my life throughout the years. And I think it's a wonderful way to connect and go forward. Larry's an amazing, brilliant person. I just wrote about him. I do write for Shutterbug. So this last article I did was on camera supports and absolutely had to put Platypod in there, and it's just not because he asked me to do it, because I wanted to do it. So that's how it sort of gives back.
Well, this is really funny because roughly an hour ago before we started this podcast, Lee Noffe, it's Noffe, I'm sorry. Her maiden name used to be Grimm, and I never remember what Lee's name is anymore. Lee Noffe does a lot of PR for us at Platypod, and she sent me this quote out of Shutterbug, and I wrote back to her and I said, who wrote it? And she said, I don't know, but I'll track it down. And then she sent me another note saying, I'll see what I can do to introduce us to the writer. I think this is hysterical. This is another example that just happened today on how small this industry really is. Because you made a comment about Platypod and camera supports. Here's somebody who doesn't know you, who sends it over to me. I didn't see the article. If I'd seen the article, I would have known who wrote it. And here we are talking about it right now.
Yes,
so just for everybody listening out there, just remember, this is a very small industry. We all go to the same rubber chicken dinners together, the same retirement parties. We've all been stuck in the same snowstorms, airports, and waiting in line to register at hotels for conventions. And it's important to build that network and remember that you never know whoever you're talking to, what their network is like and how much you both merge.
Absolutely. It's super helpful. I looked at Platypod, and I'm really, the new ball head looks fantastic. So, I'm grateful to have learned about that through Larry. And just through me talking about it, then it's on Twitter and other people, tremendous amount of people are talking about it. So it creates a conversation, and it all goes back, goes back to me meeting Larry, introducing me to his family, and yeah, so it's pretty exciting.
Just to change gears just a bit, there's something I'm curious about, because we were talking in the pre-interview chat before we started the official start of this podcast. And one thing that you mentioned, Deb, was the difference between experimental versus the experiential in your special projects process. And I've never heard anyone say it that way. Could you kind of describe what you mean by that and how that plays a role in your work?
For certain ways that I'm shooting, I love the opportunity to be experimental. So I'm trying something new. What happens if I create multiple exposures, multiple long exposures, or what happens if I shoot in a certain way? So a lot of that is experimental. But in that process, I'm learning from that experience of doing. So it's very much a part of everything. So the experiential part is just learning from that experience, then I build on that new experience. So trying something new, learning from it.
That's so cool, because what also kind of contributes to that, or rather I should say you take that a step further, when you were talking earlier about sharing the behind the scenes experience and what you learned on social media. And so I just love how you go from experimenting to the experience for yourself, to sharing that experience to others on social media, which really just helps other photographers and helps the whole industry. That's really neat.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I think a lot of people do that, and that's what makes it fun. I love to see what my friends are doing, just always pushing the envelope, always creative, no matter what their genre is, and that's pretty exciting. So that's the fun part. But there are people who are just beginning, and so that's where that need for technical knowledge. There are people who, if I don't put my shutter speed in there, like, what's your shutter speed? They don't, you know what I mean? It's just like they need a grasp. And, if you give them a guideline, and that helps them, and, helps me. So yeah, it makes it more fun.
Well, I have met photographers who hold their secrets close to themselves. Believe it or not everyone really wants to share how they create an image. And there are plenty of people who do, but there are also others who don't. So I just really appreciate your willingness to share with the industry.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor. I'm happy to do it.
Okay, so once again, because we are unscripted and we never know where these conversations go, this is not one you could see coming. But I'm curious over the years if there are lessons you learned that you wish you had known right out of the blocks. I mean, I'll give you a quick example. Joe Busing talked about early on in his career thinking that it was more gear that he needed, and he spent a lot of money on a tilt-shift lens, which he later sold for a loss, and it tied up his cash flow early on. And he should have rented it before he bought it. He should have looked at the skills and things he needed to understand how to use it. And I'm just curious if over the course of your career, there are lessons that you went, oh, wow, I wish I'd known that out of the blocks.
Absolutely. There's so many things. I mean, I think the first one, if you go back to rules, it's like you must have a good tripod. There's certain things you can't skip on with shots. You can't have a picture that is blurry because your tripod began to sag or something. So investing in as quality gear as you can, and also finding out what it is that you need, if you need a certain tripod or if you need a certain lens. So I tended to be very focused. Like when I was doing bird photography, I just had the birding lenses and the certain tripod and the Wimberley and all this heavy stuff, and that I worked with, but it was sort of in that time frame. And when I was working with infrared, it was very specific also. But I try to just keep it limited to that. So as I began to grow as a photographer, different gear became more attractive, and I began to understand the need for it. So I didn't really need that macro lens that I've never used, but I love the wide angle lens. That's a lens I couldn't live without, but that's what I do. The landscape photography, the cityscapes, I want the widest vista possible. So you really learn what it is that you need and can hone it down to what are the basics. What are the basics? But good tripod. I think that's one of the first things I learned is just you can't skip on certain things.
The basics.
Yeah.
You said it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've definitely been there where you spend too much money on gear that you don't need. Although I did learn over time, and I don't know if you ever do this, renting gear can be a wonderful option to kind of try before you buy.
That's a great tip.
Yes.
Absolutely great tip. Yeah, some people might not understand like what is into carrying a certain type of lens, or they may understand the value after, let's say they're going on a trip. Maybe you're shooting wildlife or in Tanzania. So you really need a certain lens. So it is good. You can borrow a lens, practice with it, understand if it will work for you. That's a great idea.
Well, along that same line, we had a leasing program back in my Hasselblad days, and the tagline was, why not utilize their assets without depleting yours? And that ties in with, rental is the short term, but also leasing gear. And I wish there was a way I could get photographers to understand they don't need to own everything. You can rent it, you can lease it, and do... I'm dating myself here because I don't know if leasing companies even do this anymore, but you could lease for a 2 or 3 year lease and do a $1 buyout at the end. Or you're leasing it, you're writing it off against your business, and you're leasing new gear. Every now and then somebody would come up to me in my Hasselblad days and say, I've had the same Hasselblad for 32 years. And they were excited about it. And in the beginning, I was excited because it meant the camera had the quality they could keep using. But on the other side of the coin, it started to hit me that, wow, if you had upgraded, you would have picked up on some new technologies, especially when it came to glass and optical changes. And this is where it just frustrates me because photographers, especially when you're starting out, your cash flow is limited. And so often photographers become penny wise and dollar foolish, and they cut out things that they really need. And they spend money on things they don't need, just like Joe with his tilt-shift lens story as a wedding photographer.
Absolutely. I think that's a really common mindset is that, I have to have all the equipment. But really, if you're just doing travel photography, it's better for me to have wide-angle lens, a mid-range zoom. Those are like the two very essential. And then if I can have something a little bit longer, that's fine. But I have to carry it. So I try to keep everything petite and neat. But the thing you mentioned about the technology, the technology has changed dramatically in the last few years and continuing. So it's almost hard to ride the wave, but you can kind of see where it's going to go. But it's exciting. I love the new technology and how it's affected the camera industry.
Is there one place in particular that you tend to draw your inspiration from? What do you do to get inspired? What do you do when you have what I call writer's block on my end?
Writer's block. I get that sometimes. But when I'm writing, I'm really looking at my pictures. And so sometimes I'll look at a picture and think, I really like this, but what's the next level? So I kind of think about like when I go back to that location, what is it? How can I take that shot to the next level? And it may be just changing up or again, experimenting. What is there a little bit different that I can do? But I think through that process, it all kind of works together. The writing is really, I find the inspiration through the pictures, and it's easier to write for me that way.
What about when you're photographing and do you ever you've got a camera in your hand and you didn't necessarily leave the house with a purpose?
Well, it's good to have the camera. I have this cute little camera now I keep with me all the time. So I can like just pull over and it's really easy to do that. But yeah, I think that things just happen along the way. You may just see something that is so inviting that you want to be able to get out and shoot it. So absolutely.
Okay. So Deb, with your experience with the workshops, I'm really curious, what advice would you give a new photographer just starting out today?
Oh, then a new photographer just starting out today, I would advise them to have a place, in other words, create a landing page, a blog, a website, just some place where you can start branding yourself. So people will connect your work with your name. And so I would definitely do that. And again, a simple name, your name, I think is the best, but that's just what I like to do. I say follow people with similar interests and interesting feeds that you might find influential and that helpful and beneficial to what you do. You mentioned workshops.
Yes, yes.
As far as people taking workshops, I think it's a great idea. I think it's important to manage expectations. So I would advise somebody who's just starting out who wants to learn about a particular genre, maybe it's portrait photography, or if it's more travel, whatever it is, find out what it is. Are they going to be teaching just in the field, or are they going to be teaching post-production, any type of processing or that kind of thing? And what is it that you want? So you really define what you want to pull back from a workshop by simply defining what it is that they do, and just kind of follow that person's work and see how you like that. I think it's super helpful. I think that there's really that interaction is so important, and that validation. When I was in Tanzania, I was on a trip I had 4 people with me on this tour, and it was exciting. Somebody would, okay, oh my gosh, we've got these wildebeest that are running, they're super fast. Well, how do I set up my camera? It's very, very much on the fly learning. So yes, okay, here's an idea where you might want to start your shutter speed, that kind of thing. And what are the other factors that go into that? So, that's very learning in the field. And that would be just the same for a portrait. Oh my gosh, what should be my aperture? I want to get this background all soft and blurred. So there's a lot of little things that happen very personally in that experience of a workshop. And I think that's a wonderful way. And again, you build friendships, you build future connections. So it's very important. And I would really say attending any type of photo events. There's conferences and expos, and you meet different people, you learn about what you might be interested in. And so this all, again, goes back to what you and Skip were talking about as far as relationship building.
That is great advice. There's
great answer.
Nothing like in-person learning and exchanging of creative juices, for sure. It's great. And we're already coming up on the end of our time here, which is kind of crazy, because I always say this, I've said this before, these interviews just fly by. And I want to make sure and ask, where can folks find you online, Deb?
It's very easy. Deb Sandidge is my name. So I'm Deb Sandidge on Twitter, Deb Sandidge on Instagram. My Facebook is Deborah Sandidge. But if you pretty much Google me, you can find me. I'm out there. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Excellent. And do you have any events or workshops or anything coming up that you wanted to get out there?
Oh, absolutely. So I keep all that information. So I'll be posting that on my events and workshops page of my website, which is Deb Sandidge. And I'm really honored to be the keynote speaker for Sedona Photography Synoptium in Arizona. So that is later this year in August. So I'm really excited about that. And I'll be posting that information so people who would like to go. And there's a fantastic lineup of speakers and my friends. So I'm really excited about it. Thank you.
How cool. How cool. And Skip, where can folks find you online?
Oh, hold on a second here. Yeah, if anybody's been trying to figure out what the crunching noise is in the background during any of this podcast, I chose to take a shot at having Lucy, my own little wildebeest here, in my office as opposed to crating her. So you've got a 6-month-old mini golden doodle puppy that's been chomping on a milk bone.
Now
Sorry
I get
about
it.
that, everybody. Kind of a sidestep, a big one. Hey, you'll find me at Skip Cohen on Facebook, Skip Cohen on Twitter, and everything I write is skipcohenuniversity.com. And just a reminder, we always give out our email addresses because Shamir and I are always looking for new ideas and new guests and your input. So my email is skip@mei500.com. And as I always ask, Shamira, where do they find you hiding?
Folks can...
Aren't they hiding?
Right. I'm not exactly hiding, actually. They can send me an email at shamira@photofocus.com. That is my first name, Mira@photofocus.com. As Skip mentioned, we love getting feedback, ideas, questions, because it shapes how we move forward on the show and who we have on the show. And with that said, Deb, we just want to thank you again. This has been really, really cool. We appreciate you.
Great stuff.
Yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking with both of you, and I'm excited to hear the end result. Thank you.
It is our pleasure, and we want to thank our listeners for joining us as well. Please tell your friends about this podcast, especially if they have the burning desire to improve their photography business in 2020. We look forward to having you with us next time on Mind Your Own Business, brought to you by Photofocus and Skip Cohen University.